I'm so fortunate today to be speaking with my friend Lorraine Flower in the UK about basically finding soul in your work. And I'm so grateful for you to join us. Thank you so much, Lorraine.
I'm very happy to be here, Sarah. Thank you.
I was introduced to Lorraine by my friend Jeff Eichler, and he knew that we should meet because we are in the same field of leadership development, in particular, helping people find their best selves and help them help others find their best selves. And so I'd love to start with just a quick question, Lorraine. Can you tell me something about yourself that most people wouldn't know about you?
Oh, Sarah, thank you. Yeah, something that people would, there are many things, but one of the things that comes to mind, for me, it's always interesting in hindsight because I was clear about how I was at the time, but it's been a big learning to me ever since. I happened to meet my second husband when I was in Bali on holiday, and that's not news in itself, but I then went through all of the traditional Balinese rituals in order to be married locally. We decided to be married locally. And for anybody, which won't be many people, but for anybody who knows anything about the rituals of a Balinese marriage, they are in themselves many layered. But then because I wasn't of the Hindu faith, I then had to go through and do the equivalent of a baptism, and then the equivalent of, in Christian terms, it would be called a confirmation, which they do at sort of teenage years, which involved tooth filing. And there's a tooth filing ceremony that young adults go through in Bali, which is a symbol of moving from the kind of tempestuous stage of youth into the more calm and considered stage of adulthood. And literally this swami, this priest, you're laying down in this very ornate bed and with crowds around you, and it's a big celebration, and he literally files your teeth with a metal file, the big eye teeth, the canines that we all have. And I'd said to my soon-to-be husband, I said, if that priest comes anywhere near me with that file, the wedding is off. That's it. I'm not doing it. So we went through a kind of symbolic process of filing my teeth with my mother sitting at the one end of or standing at one end of the bed, absolutely having horror attacks about what was going on to her daughter and how could I possibly be allowing this all to happen to me. It was a very rich time in my life. I'm not still married, but that's for all sorts of other reasons. But yes, it was a very culturally rich and personally challenging time to go through. But it was fascinating.
Wow, that is something I never would have imagined would come out of this story. And the reason I always ask my guests to do this is that I like to give our listeners a little context for the person that we're going to be talking to. And this was perfect context when it comes to transformation and making those decisions to leave a job and start something completely new. And it's wonderful. Thank you so much. I love that story.
Thank you, Sarah.
Part of why Jeff wanted us to meet was that he knew that we have very similar ideas about how to improve work for people.
Yes, that's my understanding, and certainly from the brief conversations we've had so far, I think you and I share a similar vision for what work is, what it can be, and the role of leaders in that journey for people.
And what I'm most fascinated by is I know the early part of your journey was giving up the corporate life because you knew there was something more. And you mentioned something during our first introductory conversation about choosing to leave work, taking a sabbatical, a kind of sabbatical with other kinds of training, and then choosing to go back thinking that you could do things differently. Can you share a little bit about that story, please?
Yeah, for sure. I was following what would have been, I guess, a pretty traditional career path at that stage in my life, and that stage in the world generally. I'd been in work for 20 years and felt like I was traveling a path of continued seniority, continued responsibility, had held lots of big leadership roles and so on. And the call to take a change in direction was something I could only describe as a soul impulse. And I wouldn't necessarily say that that language was absolutely clear to me at the time, but it was a very particular sensation and a very particular set of circumstances that led me to decide to take a sabbatical, which was how I, in a sense, positioned it with myself to make it acceptable, because it was a scary prospect to step out of a career that was going incredibly well, and I had no obvious reason to leave. And yet here I was about to hand in my notice, which I did. And so I'd kind of squared it with myself that I would take this year out, and as you said, I did various personal development things, a lot of spiritual development work, and a lot of soul searching, I guess. And as is the way with these things, headhunters kind of contacted me, and so a particular headhunter, and said, look, we've got the perfect job for you. And I said, yeah, but it's a bit early. I'm still, still only just really getting to grips with my time out. And they said, well, these jobs don't come along very often, so why don't you take a look at it? So I did. And in the 3 months of the recruitment process, I asked all of the questions I felt I needed to ask about how I wanted to work. And what had come to me clearly during the time that I'd spent thus far in sabbatical was that I didn't want to be on a treadmill. And even though I'd enjoyed pretty much every part of my working life up to that point, I was aware that I was part of a machine in many ways, and that was becoming increasingly clear to me. And I didn't want to be in that position. I wanted to be able to have more access to the whole of me, rather than be in a particular role, which I think I was starting to understand I'd been fulfilling. And yes, they said all of that would be fine, and there would be flexibility, and I wouldn't be expected to give life and soul to my job. But 2 days before I was due to start, and we'd gone through obviously the full lengthy selection process and all of that, and I'd accepted the role, and we were all geared up for me to go. I had another one of those taps from the inside, or however one might like to describe that said to me, this is not the road you need to be going down, Lorraine. And so I rang the company after, again, thinking about it quite hard. And I have to say it was the hardest phone call I've ever made in my life, to say, look, all our conversations, I honor everything we've discussed, but I won't be coming. And I'm fully aware of how costly it is for companies to go through that executive search process and all of that. So it really, it was a real values challenge for me to do that, and not just do what I'd committed to do, which typically I would have done and typically tend to do. So I made the decision not to go and join that company, but I didn't have an alternative plan at that point, and I was 38. So there was the challenge of assuming all things being equal, I still had a life, quite a long life potentially ahead of me, and at that point in time, no way of living financially. Wow. Yeah, and no plan for that either. So it's not like I'd cultivated a new plan. I just knew I couldn't do what I'd committed to do. So that was how I got to be in a situation where I was then facing a crossroads.
Of starting your own business. Had you had an idea before that you would start your own business? Had you taken on some contract work or anything like that?
No,
during that
nothing. And I see myself, and to this day I see myself as a big company girl. The career that I'd had up to that point had always been with large organizations. I kind of get how large entities work. It's in my DNA. I thrive in that space in many ways, even though they can be very toxic and very challenging depending on who you're with. But I'd had some many positive experiences in that time. But I'm a large company girl, and I'd never particularly wanted to run my own business. I hadn't particularly. I didn't want to. It wasn't on my radar. It wasn't in my plan. I had a girlfriend, close friend of mine, who had said to me, she'd gone out on her own a couple of years previously as an HR consultant. She said, look, I've always wanted us to work together. Why don't we go into partnership together? And I was in two minds, but as I allowed the idea to develop, I said, look, okay, let's do this. But for me, it has to be about spirituality in the workplace. This is the basis on which I would like to build a consultancy, a business, because in the year that or whatever, 9 months or so that I'd been in my so-called sabbatical, I'd spent a lot of time really getting to understand more about my soul. Not perfectly as I know now, some 20 odd years later, but starting to acknowledge my soul, let's put it that way. But also recognize that organizations have souls, and that there's a huge job to be done here to connect people who are in organizations and the entity itself with a recognition of its life source, of its soul. And this was what I wanted to do. So that started my independent life, as it were. It's not where it ended, but that's where it started.
That's so interesting. I keep coming back to earlier in the conversation there you were at 38, and I'm curious about your previous experiences in the machine, working in the machine. Just was there a time that you had that kind of experience with a boss or supervisor that started giving you the cues that it was that you were part of a machine? Were you ever leading a team and realized that you were falling into the same traps as the leadership of the past?
It's interesting, Sarah, because I often reflect on that process, because and maybe I have a little bit of rose-tinted glasses, but I had a very blessed career path, not easy. And looking back on it, I was naive in many ways. I was a young woman, successful young woman, more successful than many men at my age in many ways. So my career progressed very quickly. But because of that, I was always, I can see looking back, I was always cast in the pretty young woman category who happened to have intelligence and who was capable of doing things. So the kind of world of female leaders was nowhere near as developed as it is today. And yet equally, I had many privileges that came from our forerunners before that, sisters who were in the leadership game and who had already ploughed a lot of the field for us. So I'm grateful to that, and recognize that that's an ongoing journey, and that I was part of a process in that. So in many ways I was naive and grateful for whatever opportunities came my way, because they did come thick and fast. And I'm a small town girl who found herself in a huge pond, in that I worked for British Airways for 18 years. And so I went from being small town to and no particular expectations of life or career, to recognizing that actually there was huge potential. And so I was very happy with pretty much all of the opportunities that came my way, particularly because every 2 years I tended to get promoted, I tended to get bigger responsibilities. I had some fantastic things that opportunities that came my way. But if any of your listeners know anything about the psychology of human evolution, we come of age, we become adults in many ways when we're around about 35, in the kind of series of 7-year chapters. And what I'd noticed looking back was that really at around about 35, I had started to feel quite disenfranchised with an employer that I'd been with for a long time, and an employer that was deeply important to me. It was my family. It was a second family for me. So it was very much part of my soul. But I was also starting to realize that my voice wasn't able to be heard. And in fact, I was starting to have a voice. You know, I could identify my own voice. I was coming into my own leadership, not just because of a job title or numbers of people who reported to me, but because I had a stronger sense of who I was and how I wanted to be as a leader. And culturally, there was beginning to be a mismatch between who I was, how I was evolving, how I was developing, and what I could see happening in the organization, because it was on a different pathway at this point.
Tell me about this cultural mismatch. Was it related to managing people, leading people, and not being allowed to do it in the way you wanted to? Because I keep coming back to the work that you're doing now and trying to shift that to make it a more human workplace where people actually focus on the humanity of their employees. Was there a specific incident, do you think?
Well, there are a number of incidents along the way. I mean, there was very much an old school leadership style, in part within British Airways initially. Not so much in this, well, to a degree in the second organisation that I went to after I left British Airways and before I took my sabbatical. But I was increasingly aware of this old school, quite masculine, not always just lived through men, by the way, but quite masculine style, quite patriarchal style of leadership, and yet there was within me a real sense that that we needed to work in a way that was more inclusive, more holistic, where women, or if you like, feminine energy, because it isn't just about gender, but where that sort of that more sensory, that more holistic, that more relational way of leading and being with people, where that had more currency. And it was clear that there was some mismatch. So, for example, there was one person, and he's dead now, but he was a very particular old school leader, and I ended up working for him in the last year of my time there. And I'd known him for years, and we had something of a kind of getting along type relationship, but I didn't respect him. And part of that was because he's very much the old boys club. Everything was about men and boys and the club. And I don't mean it in any bad way sexually or anything like that, but just this kind of sense of superiority that came from being male and from strong, and he was completely disrespectful of me. And if I knew what I knew then what I knew now, I'd probably have handled it all very differently. But it really struck hard for me in my core. So I didn't feel well treated. And when I look back, there are examples of that along the way where I was too naive to know that I wasn't being well treated, even though I had a sense of feeling very positive about that part of my career. So I would say that there were some incidents like that, but I would say the bigger factor had more to do with the organization itself, and a recognition that organizations they're places of privilege. They're places where when we come together as groups to make up the entity of an organization, we should be able to come and bring our talents. We should be able to come and feel whole in those spaces. We should come and feel like we're truly valued for our richness, not just for our ability to manage tasks or to be part of the production machine. And I think it was really that started to have me realize that I wasn't going to change that from the inside. I had to go out and work out how to change it from the outside.
That makes so much sense. I kind of had a similar wake up when I was working for a city as the first and only public affairs officer for this particular city. And I remember realizing that I had hit kind of a plateau in terms of potential to shift the culture at all from inside.
Absolutely.
So it sounds similar. That there's a point, and one of my best friends many years ago said to me, "You can't be a prophet in your own town."
Exactly.
Yeah. So eventually, they start to take you for granted. Or, in my case, I lost my shiny newness, and I remember early on in that organization, when I had an idea, people would kind of humor me and say, "Oh, yeah, that's a great idea." And then they'd either let me implement it and just let me, or they might actually get involved if they truly thought it was a good idea. But there was a point where I came to the realization that when I would say, "Hey, I have an idea," they would roll their eyes and think, not out loud, they wouldn't say it out loud, but they think, "Oh, great, there's Sarah and she has another idea."
Yeah. I mean, I can certainly recognize that, and that shiny newness that you talk about, I think, is one of the challenges of organizations. Full stop. It's the bright and shiny, because they have to validate the fact that they've hired, and particularly depending on what type of role you've gone into, to validate that expenditure or that process or whatever, and they want to feel good about that, they being the collective organization. But I think there is also something about depth, and this comes for me to leadership, and to the way in which leaders think about their role, think about the function of leadership, and think about what the purpose of being a leader is. And so many people in leadership positions are there because of their own self interest, their own self needs. And I'm not saying they're corrupt in any obvious sense of that, but there is a corruption, because the corruption comes from the point of view of being more concerned with protecting one's own quality of life, one's own world, one's own identity, in whichever way that gets set up. And that creates a series of toxic interplays within an organization. So quite often, way too often, senior leaders have got used to a certain salary, a certain quality of life, and therefore they no longer are able to challenge the system within which they are living. And even when that starts to fail them, or it becomes toxic in some way, or there's an obvious need to make a change, self-protectionism comes in, and so we all collude to make it a certain way. And culture is like this. Culture is a collusion in many ways of behaviors, of ideas, of ideals, and that's the natural order of things. Where we want consciousness, though, where we want people to be aware and conscious, is to be really looking at that culture that's being created, and to be prepared to shift direction and alter the choices and decisions and behaviors in such a way that keeps that culture thriving and valuable for all. And so for me, it was leadership, and still is, that is one of my kind of key areas of interest, because all too often I sit with senior leaders and ask them, what's your motivation for being in a senior leadership position? And many of them cannot answer that question. They they recognize that they've got a function, they recognize they've got responsibilities, but in terms of the values and the kind of more systemic, holistic perspective of leadership, many of them don't have answers to that. And to me, that's one of the things we have to change in organizational life. That particularly if you're in a position, a place of positional power, you've got to take this role of leadership far more seriously, and that includes the humanness, the way in which we relate with people, which is kind of the other part of my work, really.
The thing that just popped into my head was related to a leader. Well, he wasn't really a leader, but a manager that I worked with, that I think, excuse me, I think in a technical sense, he knew that as a leader, it was his job to care about his employees. I think in the technical sense, he understood that, but not in a soulful sense. But I think what has to happen next, if you can get that answer out of them, if you can help them verbalize that leadership is about caring about each person, bringing their whole selves to work and being in a place that they feel safe and confident to innovate and to do what they know is necessary to do to be successful. I think the next step has to be that those leaders also have to feel strongly enough to address conflict,
Yes.
which is where I see the biggest issue in leadership is that they start getting so comfortable that even if they do know the why behind their leadership, they're not willing to fight for it. So when conflict arises, they ignore it or sweep it under the rug or pretend like they've dealt with it. But it does so much damage when they don't address things like bullying that they know is going on.
Mm-hmm. I'm so with you on that, Sarah. In fact, I'm thinking about a couple of examples myself as you raise that, both in the same organisation, and where I was working with each of these two leaders individually, and one of them said to me, I kind of know how this organisation works, and therefore I've worked out how to navigate. And we were in a coaching relationship, and so I was inquiring with him about the question of leadership and about how he would choose to be more effective and more impactful. And he had all of the right knowing and understanding about what needed to be done, and even how he might go about it. But he was very clear with himself that that if he followed that path, he would feel that it would lead to a lot of risk for him personally, and he preferred to play a safer game, even though from a soul point of view, he was increasingly disillusioned and dissatisfied, and he was so mired that he couldn't actually choose at this point anyway. I always believe that things will happen at whatever point they're meant to, and we make different choices. Those crossroads do come up. Somebody
you
once
get uncomfortable enough, right?
Yes, exactly. You get uncomfortable.
Like what you did at 38.
Yeah. It just comes at different times for different people. And then in the same organization, there's another person who, in fact, I'm still working with, who found himself in a role that is not familiar to the organization, and it was a much more cross-cutting role, and much more systems-based, as in thinking about the organization as a system. And he and I started talking about systems leadership, and what did it mean to be effective as an influencing leader, as opposed to a leader who had P&L responsibility, or who had operational responsibility, but as someone who was, as his role had developed, was more about trying to influence the organization to think differently and to approach things differently. And this person is going through quite a journey as he redefines his interpretation of leadership. And he had his daughter come into work one day, and on a kind of shadowing day, something to do with work experience, and so she followed him around, and in fact he's a technician, he's an engineer, this person, very senior leader. And at the end of the day, she said to him, well, Dad, I've learned a huge amount, she said, because I've always thought about you and imagined you as an engineer. And that's, I've had in my mind that you're doing all sorts of things that are technical and engineering related. She said, but having seen you working today, she said, what I realize is that, in fact, all of your time is spent thinking about people and how to help people to be more effective, and how to support people, and, how to make it a more inclusive environment, and so she had, and even though he was technically in kind of an engineering type role, she had a very different perspective on what he was doing. And this was so heartening. You'd said to me earlier, what keeps us going? People like us who see a bigger world, a different way in which organizations and leaders can function. When you get those sorts of stories, and that people are living their truth, even though it's not easy, and even though organizationally they're not necessarily always supported in that, then you think, okay, there's another warrior out there who's taken up the challenge to bring the right things into play. Whether they can do it or not doesn't matter at this point. There just has to be enough of us out there trying to do it, inside and outside.
That was a soft lob. It was a perfect transition into that part of the conversation that I wanted to talk about. But first, I am curious about when your client told you about his daughter's perception of his work, was he a little surprised by her perception?
Completely flawed.
Okay, so he didn't see himself that way necessarily.
Well, he was, I think what he was surprised by, not so much that he didn't see himself that way, but that it was evident to other people. And particularly his daughter, who wasn't necessarily versed in all the ways of large organizations. So she was, I don't know, I guess about 17, 18, something like that, a teenager. But she clearly was perceptive and clearly intelligent and bright enough to see things. So I think he was quite surprised that she was able to pick up on who he is as a person, and certainly who he's allowing to be seen. So the fact that it was visible, I think, was the thing that was affirming for him, but also somewhat surprising for him as well. Yes. Because I think he knew what journey he was going on inside of himself, but he wasn't entirely sure what was showing up on the outside. And of course, I don't see him in that day-to-day sense. I hadn't shadowed him for a day or whatever, seen him in action. But this young, I'm not going to say naive because I don't know, but this fresh perspective that was coming through his daughter played back to him all the phrases, all the ideas that we'd been working on in our one-to-one sessions and that he's been working on out there in the workplace. And so I think for him it was very affirming and spurred him on to be more of it, do more of it, to know he's on the right track in some ways.
Yes. Oh my gosh, I love that story. I just got chills.
Yeah, and I had chills at the time because wow, that's
she so much confirmation
as well. So I would love to meet her at some point, but
yes.
And I hope she's going to go on and do great things, whatever they might be.
That's what I was thinking about too. I already love this young woman, and I don't know her, and I have no way of knowing her. But I keep thinking about something that I talk a lot about in my coaching, and particularly in workshops and keynotes, is personal brand and why it's so important to be intentional about your behavior and what you're putting out there, because often there's such a big perception gap between how you think you're being perceived and how you're actually being perceived. And what he was able to do through her observation was see that he had shrunk that perception gap, at least with that particular person, which means that it's likely that he has closed that gap a bit across the board.
Yes. And as you, sorry, go on. Yeah,
no, go ahead.
Yeah, it is. Well, and I think it's interesting because for me, it's one of the challenges in the work that we do is that, when people are committed to their own personal development, their professional development, their leadership development, there are some nutty challenges, I think, that come in around this whole thing of perception and personal brand, which is that, if you've been in an organization for quite a long time and people know you as, Sarah, who behaves in this way and does things in a certain way, and you've got certain character traits and preferences and, ways of showing up, and one takes oneself through a bigger journey or, something that is even evolutionary. The challenge, I think, for so many of us, and this was, again, one of the reasons why I chose to ultimately leave the organizations that I did in both cases, is because to reinvent ourselves, to allow ourselves to catch up with the inner work that we've done, we sometimes need to kind of lift ourselves out of a situation and go and take that brand out for a run somewhere else, if you see what I mean. And that allows us to connect our inner and outer more fully. And it sets, it's almost like a step up or a new level of operating software that's been downloaded, but now can actually be used in practice. And sometimes that's very hard to do when you're in an environment that wants to keep you the same, even if they would like to see you do some things differently. There's a safety in us keeping things the same. And for me, again, this is a capability that leaders need to really confront within themselves, which is, how do we how do we embrace that possibility of change and to suspend our judgments or our perceptions, allow for new to come in the way another person may choose to show up, or in the way in which we do things around here? How do we really, really open ourselves to that? Because as humans, we're quite reluctant when it comes to change.
Mm-hmm.
We
And
have to be
changing our
dragged a bit
minds,
kicking and screaming.
changing our minds in
And
particular.
yes, yes.
And I'm brought back to an earlier episode of my podcast where I interviewed Mark Bowden up in Toronto, and he talks about the importance of inauthenticity, in the sense that when you are trying to transform, when you're trying to make those changes, and the people around you are trying to keep you where you are because that's more comfortable, both for them and for you, because transformation from any direction is uncomfortable. But they, even if they love you, they don't necessarily want to see you transform because it's uncomfortable. And so there's this risk of them saying that what you're transforming into is somehow inauthentic. And that shaming by describing somebody as being inauthentic is definitely a negative description. I am sure that that's an insult in most cases. So I think this plays that same role, is that when you're trying to transform, you're trying to get a coach so that you can be a better leader, so that you can be more comfortable in your soul when you're at work. That's not easy.
It's not easy. It's not easy at all. And I think that also the other part of that equation is that, and we see this in relationships all the time, don't we? That as we make our shifts, it causes an equal and opposite reaction for others around us. And whether they like it or not, they have to adjust. Not because one is saying to them, you must change, but that as we make our pathway in life, as we discover what that is, and we intentionally explore that, it means that others risk either getting left behind or making other choices. And again, in my own journey, I again reflected on this quite a bit over the years, that I had one girlfriend who happened to be in HR. My career wasn't spent in HR. I had to retrain and redevelop myself to do what I'm doing today. But I remember her saying at the time that she was really not impressed that I decided to come into her field when I hadn't done all the training that she'd done at that point. And she was, clearly not very happy about it. And then eventually I got an email from her one day, and I thought we were pretty close friends and I thought we were getting on okay. She sent me an email that said, I've decided we can no longer be friends because I don't like the way you're living your life. Now, I never got an explanation of that, and she never elaborated any further as to what that was. We haven't spoken since. I have seen her once or twice in the early years. I happened to bump into her, but she's never explained that, and we haven't remained in contact or whatever. But as a symbol, it's not really even about the specifics of that story, but the symbol there is that as we choose to connect with our soul, and as we choose to commit ourselves to being the full expression of our qualities, if others don't resonate with that, or we're a bit clunky in the way we do it, because we're not going to get it right. This inauthenticity is giving ourselves permission to have a go, mess it up, have another go. We have to be committed to that process as well. And no doubt I did or said something that was inelegant, or she didn't like, or whatever, and I get all of that. But there's something about when people can see you're on a pathway, it can challenge them quite strongly. And this is true for leaders. If they depart too far from the ground that everybody else has tested, then that can cause them a lot of backlash and a lot of and loss of face, perhaps a loss of currency in an organization, because they're no longer operating within the norms.
So you're saying that she was kind of your cue, a clue as to what to expect from other people as you were transforming.
Absolutely, and that as I've inquired more and more fully into this thing we're calling soul, because another key part of my work is linked to this growing consciousness and awareness. It's I've come to learn over the years that as we become the fuller expression of our soul qualities, and what we were born to be, if I can put it that way, and those qualities, at the risk of sounding very Pollyanna, are very beautiful. They're loving, they're kind, they're considerate, but they're strong and willful and intentional. There's lots of qualities there that express our fullness, and the more we are prepared to go in search of those and bring them into our lives, and in this case particularly into leadership, we are going to find that people fall away from us. If I look at my friendship group now compared to what it was when I was in my corporate career, it's completely different. And that's not to make it bad or good or whatever, but you resonate with different people. And I think this is what probably worries leaders in organizations, is that they pick up a vibration. There's a note playing, there's a tune playing. They may not be able to put a language to that, but there's something they recognize. And so they go in and they're part of that. And then they try not to change the tune. But evolution requires that we advance that we refine it, that we find new notes, new aspects to the note to play. And that requires us to be prepared to step into that place of personal change and collective change. And that's, if we don't have the resources or the language or the skills for that, that's very hard, coupled with all the pressure that so often we see, particularly in profit organizations, the pressure on money, although also in not-for-profits or public organizations, the same is true. And that drives a certain set of behaviors that cut across a lot of what we've been talking about today.
So given that difficulty, how do you stay motivated and not discouraged when we still see so much, and we don't always feel like we're seeing changes? As a coach, as a leadership development person myself, there are days where I feel really discouraged when I continue to see the bad behavior and leaders not addressing the conflict that they need to address.
Well, it's interesting, you see, because I absolutely understand what you're describing, and I have days like that too, for sure. What I'm trying to learn, and I think I'm increasingly recognizing, is firstly, one has to connect with a bigger picture, and that there are, this world, our world, will change, and it will change for the better, and we're part of making that happen. So by being prepared as coaches, as consultants, as leaders, we're all part of that process of improving the quality of our world, and we can see in the macro picture that is happening, in terms of the quality of work life. Overall, on many levels, it is improving. So I try to keep reminding myself about that. I also find that I've had to learn how to disidentify, if I could use that phrase, which is to say that I have to stop making it personal. If I believe in what I'm doing, which I do, then I have to trust that providing I show up in the right way, and I remain in integrity with the work that I'm trying to do, and remain in integrity with myself. None of these things are easy, by the way, but if I can keep committing myself to all of that, then whether I can actually see a change today or not isn't really the point, because we're tilling the soil, and somewhere at some point it will land, whether we ever know about it or not. And it's our ego that wants to know. It's our ego that wants to be affirmed that actually we're doing good work here, and it's all, we're heading in the right direction, and it's normal, that's human. But we have to move beyond that, and that then you get surprises like the story I told you about the man and his daughter, but also where people will say to me, I'll meet them 5-10 years maybe down the road, and they'll say, you know what, when you said such and such, it really stuck with me. And I think, well, you showed no sign of that at the time. There was no clue that anything I'd said had made any difference, or anything that we'd explored had made any difference. And yet you just never know. And that's the thing I keep telling myself. We just don't know. We have no idea what legacy, what connection, what little nugget, anything, either specifically in those one-to-ones or more generally if we're working with groups, we just don't know. And we have to get our ego out of the way and trust that if we're working in the right way and we're doing our own inner development work, then we show up as beacons for the possibility of something new, and people will take from that what they will.
Beautiful. And that brings us right back to Jeff Eichler, because you used the word possibility. He sent me the book, The Art of Possibility, and it has altered how I see things in many ways. So I'm grateful for that, and I'm grateful for his introduction to you. Lorraine, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Sarah.
I appreciate the time that you took.
I appreciate the connection with you, and I feel we are very much soul sisters working in this pot together. And even though we're in different parts of the world, and we may never physically get to work together, for me, energetically, we are, and as many others in our collective networks are doing too. So that's what I believe in, and that's what sustains me.
Thank you. And this does create some comfort for me when it comes to those days that I'm discouraged, just knowing that we're in this together. I have